Better World Blueprint. Good humans doing good things.
Ever found yourself doom scrolling, sucked into a vortex of awful news or vacuous influencer reels? It can leave you feeling down, empty, and unmotivated. It's easy enough to do. You don't even have to be on social media to be inundated with news that makes you feel hopeless. I'm Siobhan Hunt, and my aim with this podcast is to give you an alternative. By talking to people who are making this world a better place, I want to leave you feeling inspired and hopeful. This is A Better World Blueprint. Death and dying aren't topics we're great at dealing with. Facing our own mortality can be frightening. I know it frightens me. And when someone we love is dying, it can be incredibly hard. Anne Myers is a palliative care nurse who works in the community. She'll go to people's homes and help them care for their loved ones. In the process, she's learnt a thing or two about making this world a better place. This is palliative care nurse Anne Myers. What led you to do this work?
I'd been working in ICU as a nurse for quite a few years, and when I was 35, my mother died, and her death was quite a gentle death, and I was working in ICU surrounded by equipment, very high tech. There was nothing gentle about it, and I was very familiar with death. I'd seen a lot of people die, but this was probably the first significant personal death in my life. And I think I didn't know what to do with my grief. And because my mother had such a gentle death where there was nothing else in the room, it was sort of like dying had all the moves. And I was completely thrown by the emptiness of all of that. So, I went back to working into ICU, but suddenly it was like I wasn't interested in those that got to live and leave the unit. I was more interested in those that died in the unit. And I remember one woman who came into our unit sort of late. I was working a PM shift that day, and I think it was a couple of weeks after Mum had died. And this woman wasn't well. I knew that she would probably die overnight, but, all the equipment was put on her. She was tubed, popped on a ventilator. And I remember chatting to the daughter who was in the room for most of the shift. And my shift was up. I had to go home. I was exhausted. It had been a 12-hour shift. And I remember leaving the unit and passing her sitting in a chair out in the waiting room. And she sort of grabbed my arm and sort of said to me, is my mother going to die? And normally in ICU, you have your standard conservative replies, look, we'll just see how we go. I don't know how she's going to go. Wait and see until the morning. But I knew that she would die overnight. And I think just the state of grief that I was in with my own mother, I just kind of said to her, yes, your mother is going to die. And she thanked me. And I think I went out into the car and burst into tears. But anyway, the beautiful thing was a few weeks later, I was working a shift and there was a present sitting up on the desk addressed to me. And I opened it and it was a Christmas angel. The person had put, to my angel from the daughter. I know, it's so beautiful. And I actually hang that up at the top of our Christmas tree every year. So it was those kind of experiences that were happening that led me to start exploring death and dying. So, Mum dying was the instigator of me working in palliative care.
So you were already working in the health system. What did you do once you thought to yourself, okay, this is where I want to be in the health system. I want to work in palliative care?
I think it was very organic. So I was in the ICU at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. And I think if there was any education sessions on palliative care, off I'd trot. I think it was more out of curiosity about my own grief. I just wanted some answers. I sort of turned up saying, oh, I'm a nurse and I'm really interested in palliative care, but really I was there as the grieving daughter. So I don't know. I think it was less than a year, maybe even 8 months later, I started doing some casual shifts in the palliative care unit upstairs in Caritas Christi. And I think it was curiosity that drove me there. I just wanted to see death and dying up close and what did it look like, because most of the people in ICU did live and leave the unit. And I remember, sitting outside waiting to have my interview to go on to their casual bane. And I just remember going, gosh, everyone on this floor is going to die. I know I'd seen death, but I was completely overwhelmed that everyone on this floor has a terminal diagnosis. So anyway, I started working up there, and that was quite overwhelming. Like, just to have deaths up close, I didn't really have a language around it. I didn't know how to talk to patients. I think I did a lot of sad faces in those first few months because I was scared of saying the wrong thing. And my goal was I wanted to work in communities. So I was working inpatient really just to skill up and learn about everything, sort of symptom management, and also just, sort of psychosocial as well, which I think really I found that more in community rather than in inpatient.
And so when you say in community, that means you go out to their homes?
Yes, yeah.
And look after them in their homes. Did you ever stumble in that process? You talked about in the early days feeling quite overwhelmed. Were there moments like that or other things that sort of set you back on the path of becoming a palliative nurse?
I think the biggest or the hardest thing I found was developing a language around death and dying when you're in someone's home. I think you could hide behind a medical team a bit more inpatient, like they had the family meetings, you would go in and sit and listen, but you really had to step up and you were the ones in the house, and often you're the only nurse, with a whole table of relatives all looking at you for the answers. And early days doing some of those assessments, you stand for a lot going into that house. There's a referral, you're coming in as this person that means that there is someone who's got a terminal diagnosis in the house. So yeah, that took a lot of time and a lot of skill. And really, I think it was probably 4 or 5 years before up and running and kind of really knowing how to have those conversations.
It sounds like you need to be a bit of a psychologist in many ways.
I think a lot, like we do have, like there's a nursing team and there's an allied care team, which is made up of counsellors as well. And often you will do joint visits. And I think I learnt a lot from going out with them, because it was like, oh, how do they talk about that when the subject comes out? So that was almost a masterclass, having some of, these brilliant colleagues out with me. So you sort of just pick up tips, but there is a lot of psychology. And it's almost, when you've been doing it a long time, we almost say we have a superpower in going into people's homes, that you get to gauge a sense. You'll walk in the front door and meet the family and you know exactly how it's going to go. If they're a super anxious family, or they're all on the same page, or there's some bit of hostility between some siblings. You've seen it all when you've been doing it for quite a while. So the whole psychology of it is kind of what I love about the work.
Has this work changed you?
Absolutely. I definitely, my mortality is very front and center, that life is finite, life is precious. Don't hold off doing things if you really want to do it. It's like I say, if you're in a relationship or a job you don't like, do something about it, because death comes for everyone. And it's not the first time that you get a referral from someone who's just retired and they've got the caravan in the driveway and they're about to go around Australia, and they get a cancer diagnosis, and that's dreams over, and they've worked hard their whole life, have saved up. It's heartbreaking. So you just don't know what's around the corner. So it is very much about seizing the day a little bit.
What about the difference between in-home versus hospital care? I'm just thinking of my dad was very unwell a couple of years ago. He has Parkinson's and he got sick and was in and out of hospital care. We had some pretty grim diagnoses at the time, but generally speaking, the whole experience was so confusing. And quite alienating being in that system. And I remember at one point when he was really unwell, and, we'd call the ambulance, he'd go back in, and then we'd come out, and then we'd have to do the same again. And my sister and I, we were talking about it, and we just wanted him to be able to die at home if that's what was going to happen. So the thought of us making the call to take him into hospital instead of letting him pass peacefully at home was devastating to us. So I'm wondering about whether you've seen that kind of impact of the care you give when it's in home care.
Look, we always say to people there's no right or wrong way in how to do this, and every family is different. And I mean, it was really highlighted in COVID when they didn't want to send their loved ones into palliative care units because it meant they couldn't visit them. So people made the decision to keep their loved ones at home when they were families that were not really able to cope with keeping loved ones at home. So that created its own difficulties. We also say, we might meet a family and the client will say, I want to die at home. As we continue to visit them and we meet their family more, we kind of think, I don't think they're going to be able to cope, but it's important to be able to let them try and see how they go. And we always say, you can say one thing and then I want to stay at home. And then it gets, to the 11th hour. And for whatever reason, sometimes people's symptoms are really hard to manage at home and they really do need to go in. And it may just be not necessarily for end of life care, but we keep it fluid. And if people change their minds and say, yes, I do want to go in, then that's fine too. But it's nice for you to say that, yes, we want to keep Dad at home. And you being an advocate for him is more than likely that will be the outcome. But also sometimes that doesn't happen. Or it might be that someone is becoming less conscious and the family say, oh, we actually want him to go into a palliative care unit now. Then there's always the chance they may die in an ambulance on the way there, which is always very stressful. But then at the same time, for some people, as long as everything's being done to care for them, that's acceptable as well. So everyone comes to it with their own angle and there's no right or wrong way to do it. There'll be some family members that, often the relative that hasn't had a lot of input with care, perhaps interstate, might have the strongest voice and saying, Mum or Dad have to die at home, but they haven't been doing the hands-on. And that care, that actual physical day in and day out care is very, very hard on people and it can make or break them.
You mentioned that story about the daughter who gave you the angel and that kind of helped to move you along in the work. Do you ever get that sort of feedback now, all these years later, in terms of how people feel about the work you're doing?
Like a year after someone's died, volunteers write out cards, a nice card to send to the family just to say we're thinking of you on the anniversary. And often that is the most touching thing because, a year's gone by, everyone's got on with their lives. And out of the blue, this card comes from this service that will often just completely send them into tears. And they will often reach out and contact the service just to say, gosh, that meant a lot to me, that the card, so simple. Gosh, even makes me a bit teary. So we have a lot of, we have a huge Italian population, Greek, and often partners will come back and be volunteers. And it's fabulous because then they can go into a Italian-speaking family, Greek-speaking, Turkish, whatever. Of course we need more of them, but that's just wonderful that they felt supported enough that they could come back and give their time to others.
I feel like death and dying, it's kind of one of those truisms. We're all going to die, but it seems to be the thing that most humans want to turn away from. They don't want to embrace it. They don't want to work in or around people who might be dying. But I feel like what you do is so important and makes such a difference to people's day-to-day life. Can you see that? Can you see that actually in stepping into that space you are making that difference?
I think the most satisfying thing about going into people's homes is, some days you arrive at a house and I talk about energy, you can just feel it's high energy. The client might be symptomatic, in pain, or they've been vomiting, or they've been up all night, no one's had any sleep. There's just a general chaos, overwhelm, can't cope. And you sort of get in there, roll up your sleeves, get their symptoms better managed, sit down and have a chat to the family about what to expect. I guess our role is to stay a couple of steps ahead and predict, I guess, what's going to happen next, perhaps in the next day or two. And then, a sense of peace comes over the house and the client's back asleep. And you leave and it's so satisfying. And you just think, yes, I've left that family. They can contact us at any time. There's a sense of they feel they can cope with what is coming up. And that's very tangible. You can see the difference when you leave a house. And I forget sometimes the experience that we all have with all the years we've been working there, but that is a lot of experience to get from A to B. And that's probably my favourite part of the role.
Palliative care nurse Anne Myers. Anne is also a writer and a horse lover. To find out how these things shape her world, check out the links in the episode notes. When women start getting older, there's this thing that happens, and you can start to feel invisible, particularly when you're over 40. Next time on A Better World Blueprint, I'm so excited to be speaking with Faith Agugu, who's the founder of Silver Sirens. It's a network for women over 50 who are keen to not disappear. So if you're keen to listen to that chat, make sure you come back to A Better World Blueprint. I'm Siobhan Hunt. See you then.